Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Going to give people a chance to hop on. For those of you just joining us, I see that we are still having participants join on, so we'll wait just another minute before we get started. All right, why don't we go ahead? Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our forum webinar series. I'm Kendra Parson, Field Officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I'll be moderating this webinar today. In case you don't know, Preservation Leadership Forum is the professional membership program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This webinar series is made possible by members of Preservation Leadership Forum, and we sincerely thank those of you who are with us today. As part of the work of the National Trust African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, we have been working to highlight the people, places, and stories associated with Brown versus Board of Education. Though often thought of as being associated only with Kansas, Brown v. Board was in fact a portfolio of cases from communities in Kansas, South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Delaware, and Virginia. Today's webinar is the second in a series to broaden our understanding of this history. For those of you who missed our first webinar in February, a conversation with Cheryl Brown Henderson, founding president of the Brown Foundation for Educational Equity, Excellence, and Research, you can watch a recording of that webinar at forum@savingplaces.org. Today's webinar will tell the story of the Robert Russa Moton School in Farmville, Virginia. We will hear from Cameron Patterson, Executive Director of the Robert Russa Moton Museum. We will also share video messages from U.S. Senators Mark Warner and Tim Kaine of Virginia. And towards the end of our session, my colleague Pam Bowman will provide updates on the work of the National Trust to help create National Park Service affiliated areas in Delaware, Virginia, and the District of Columbia for sites associated with the Brown v. Board case, as well as expanding the Brown v. Board of Education National Historic Site to include related sites in South Carolina. Before we begin, I'll share a couple of housekeeping notes. Automatic closed captioning is available for this webinar. To enable closed captioning, just click on the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will take questions from the audience during the webinar. Please send questions via the Q&A function directly to panelists. You are welcome to submit a question at any point during the webinar, but we will be waiting until our Q&A section to answer your questions. You're also encouraged to communicate to all participants through the chat function. Following the program, we will send out a recording of today's webinar directly to the email that you used to register. And finally, all forum webinars are archived in our forum webinar library. Next slide, please. Now we will share video messages from Senators Warner and Kaine. The senators unfortunately were not able to join us today, but they wanted to share a few words about the importance of commemorating this history.
I'm Virginia Senator Mark Warner, and I'd like to thank the National Trust for Historic Preservation for allowing me to say a few words today. We know we've gone through enormous challenges over the last year and a half. We've seen COVID, we've seen the brutal murder of George Floyd, we've seen the beginning of a reckoning of the need to address systemic racial injustice in our country. And it's important, if we do that, to tell the whole history of America. And for me, that also means the whole history of Virginia. An important part of that history took place back in the early 1950s in Farmville, Virginia, where a young woman named Barbara Johns led a walkout of the then segregated all-black Moton High School in Farmville. Barbara Johns' activities at Moton High School was rolled into a civil rights case that ultimately became part of Brown versus Board of Education, the historic Supreme Court case that desegregated America's public schools. Again, a lot of that only took place because of the courage of Barbara Johns and her fellow students to have that walkout at Moton High School. Over the years, I've been part of efforts to commemorate that and make sure that Moton High School is preserved for part of Virginia and national history. I was proud as governor to build a statue to commemorate Barbara Johns and others' efforts for racial justice in Virginia that now stands on Capitol Square in Richmond. So I want to particularly thank the National Trust for recognizing that Moton High School needs to be preserved. This is an investment that I've made on a personal basis to make sure that building is preserved. I want to thank the National Trust, and I'm proud that I led federal legislation to commemorate this site as well. It's terribly important, if we're going to build better Virginia and better America, that we preserve these important parts of our history. Thanks so much.
Hey, everybody. Hey everybody, Senator Tim Kaine here. I'm proud to join this webinar where the National Trust is bringing people together to talk about the legacy of Brown versus Board of Education, the most momentous case that the Supreme Court of the United States has ever decided. And as a civil rights lawyer who practiced in the courts, state and federal, in Virginia and elsewhere for many, many years, it's a legacy that offers lessons for today and for tomorrow. You're going to hear from folks at the Moton Museum in Farmville, Virginia. It's an amazing museum that I visited with my family a number of times in the site of the former Moton High School. This was the high school where a young student, Barbara Johns, led a student walkout in the early 1950s, going out and taking students out with her because they didn't like separate and unequal in the community of Farmville in Prince Edward County. They reached out to attorneys that I came to know, Oliver Hill, and asked Mr. Hill to represent them in a lawsuit challenging unequal school conditions. He didn't want to do it because he was too busy with other civil rights cases, but he said, how can I turn down a request from students? The case that he brought that was eventually consolidated with 5 other cases, becoming Brown versus Board, was the only case that was inspired by students, a student walkout. Others, it was adults or teachers or school board members, but there was one student walkout, and it was the Barbara Johns walkout that led to the case in Prince Edward County. Barbara Johns is memorialized with a wonderful monument on the Capitol Square. I was the chairman of the commission to raise funds, and I unveiled the monument to Virginia's civil rights heroes with Barbara Johns on it when I was governor. And now we're excited, having removed the statue of Robert E. Lee, a Virginia contribution to the U.S. Capitol. We're excited that a new statue of Barbara Johns will be in Statuary Hall so that every visitor to our nation's capital who looks at the great American heroes can learn about the story of this talented, dynamic, and a courageous young woman. So please enjoy the webinar today, and I'm glad I could offer a few words of just encouragement to you.
Thank you so much, Senators, for providing these comments. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Cameron Patterson, Executive Director of the Robert Russa Moton Museum, who will tell us more about the story of the Moton School in Farmville, Virginia. As a reminder, you can share your questions for our speaker via the Q&A function.
Good afternoon. It is my honor to join to share a bit about the Moton School story and our work here at the Robert Russa Moton Museum. I'm Cameron Patterson, Executive Director, and it is my honor to be a caretaker for an important story that is important to the nation and really to the world in terms of how our country has worked to advance civil rights and education, a fight that still continues to this day. As we begin, I would love the opportunity to share a video that highlights our work and centers a few of the individuals that are on the front lines of helping us to communicate this history. We can play the video. I always believe in the power of place. To be in this space where history happened, I think that makes a powerful connection with folks that visit. My name is Cam Patterson, and I am the managing director of the Robert Russa Moton Museum here in Farmville, Virginia. I mean, we kind of frame ourselves as the birthplace of the student-led civil rights movement. So these students were doing these courageous acts before their time.
The generation of students at Moton were a bellwether for what would later be what we associate with the student movement of the 1960s.
And we are now sitting in the auditorium of the Moton Museum, which was formerly the Robert Russa Moton High School. Barbara Rose Johns led a strike on April 23rd, 1951, of over 400 students, and I was one of the strikers. I was in the 8th grade. Before the strike, the conditions that we were studying under were deplorable. We had no gymnasium. We didn't have a cafeteria. In the whites-only school, the conditions were extremely different. They had all of the amenities that we did not have. Barbara felt that something had to be done. And then she gave her speech saying that we didn't have to accept that anymore of being like a second-class citizen. And then that's when everybody started to get up and everyone walked out. I never thought it would be a 13-year struggle. Well, I personally feel that what Barbara did was very necessary. It was courageous, and it not only changed this community, it changed America.
Right now, I'm standing in front of the Prince Edward County Courthouse. Well, I was born in Prince Edward County in a little area called Prospect, Virginia. And in 1959, that's when schools closed. And the 4th grade was my last year of attending schools in Prince Edward County. Prince Edward County joined the Brown versus Board of Education Topeka, Kansas suit. And as a result of that, the Board of Supervisors in Prince Edward County decided rather than integrate the schools, that they would close. So in 1959, as I said, when I was in the 4th grade, the schools closed in Prince Edward County, and there were no public schools for any students. My dad rented an old dilapidated house in Appomattox County, and we pretended that we lived there. Every morning on his way to work, he would drop us off, and we would have to hide out behind the house until we heard the school bus coming. And then we would go through the back door and through the front and get on the bus. And when we started off, there were about six kids there. But before that 2-year period was over, we had as many as 21 children some days coming to that house and pretending that they lived there.
We are sitting in the sanctuary of First Baptist Church in downtown Farmville. Places of public assembly were all segregated at the time. Movie theaters were segregated. So African Americans had begun too to kind of push against these boundaries of segregation during the war years. By 1963, schools here in Prince Edward County have been closed for 4 years. And there were a lot of young people here who had not received any formal education for 4 years. And so young people wanted to protest against these conditions. So the photographs of the 1963 protests were actually not taken by journalists, but were taken by police deputies who were watching and monitoring the actions of the student protesters. That's why in so many of the photographs, the students aren't looking at the photographer because they were aware that they were under surveillance. And so one of the most powerful images is of Doris Williams, now Berryman, looking straight into the face of the camera. She had just tried to buy a ticket at the State Theater, which denied entrance to African Americans. And she has a real look of defiance on her face. She wants the photographer to know who she is.
I am a Prince Edward County native, born and raised. I'm a great-grandson of a plaintiff in Brown versus Board of Education, as well as two of my great-aunts were plaintiffs. My dad was actually out of school for all 5 years when schools were closed, from 1959 to 1964. He was 6 when the schools closed down in 1959, and then when he went back, he was 11 years old. Luckily, he graduated high school at age 22, but he was the same age as his high school geometry teacher. We have a huge sense of place here in Farmville. I've lived in Prince Edward all my life. I love this area, and I just think that it has so much potential to do some good.
And so Main Street is a place where we encourage people to come and explore Virginia's history, but also enjoy everything in between, which includes shopping, great restaurants, great art here downtown.
You can take advantage of our civil rights walking tour. We have become a strong historical and cultural arts destination.
Coming to places like Farmville and the Moton Museum really underscore the fact that these are truly stories of citizens who take it upon themselves to really make America live up to its ideals. And so these places give us great hope.
Use history as a source of healing and to not repeat those same mistakes as opposed to just forgetting it and pretending and closing that chapter of our history forever.
I think people can learn a lot from Virginia history. There's a lot that happened here that caused other things to happen in the country. The fact that these schools were closed, the fact that the majority, 75% of the plaintiffs in the Brown decision were from Prince Edward County. The fact that the movement was led by a 16-year-old student in 1951. Those things are historical events that the whole country needs to know about.
Farmville is a place, and Prince Edward is a place where ordinary people made extraordinary change. And that's something that I think we all have to remember and keep in mind in our own lives.
Thank you for allowing me to share that. I thought it was very important to center my colleagues who helped to carry out this important work. And I also think that it shows something that's at the heart of our work as a museum, and that's the commemoration and preservation of the stories of students and families whose personal courage and sacrifice helped to make important advancements as it relates to education. Here at the Moton Museum, we are about helping to promote the ideals of citizenship, empowerment, responsibility. These are the guiding principles that are at the heart of the permanent exhibit that we share, Moton School Story, Children of Courage. And as was mentioned, this story, I truly believe, teaches us that ordinary citizens, children even, as we talk about, have used the levers of democracy to bring about change. They utilize the court systems as their way to make important advancements. And so this story, we talk about it in the lens of a 13-year period between 1951, when Barbara Rose Johns leads that student walkout, and 1964, after Prince Edward County reopens its public schools after having been closed for 5 years. And so there are two Supreme Court cases that bookend that. You have Brown v. Board of Education, of which Prince Edward County is involved, as well as the court case Griffin versus County School Board of Prince Edward that reopens public schools. As I share a bit about this history, I do so through that lens of the walkout and the lockout generation. As important as it is to talk about Barbara Johns and her classmates who were at the front end of helping to really launch Prince Edward's involvement in this legal effort, I also have to talk about those students who were impacted by the school closings, because that is the aftermath of Brown v. Board that we experience following this period of massive resistance in the Commonwealth as the county worked to do all that they could to ensure that we didn't integrate public schools along with the Commonwealth of Virginia and others. Now, I always share that the significance of Farmville and Prince Edward County isn't limited to the 20th century. In this period that we talk about, Prince Edward County was home to the community of Israel Hill, a group of emancipated people who before the Civil War became successful farmers, merchants, and artisans. Prince Edward County was a place that made significant advancement in the post-Reconstruction era, electing the first Black representative to the Virginia General Assembly. It would be a place that W.E.B. Du Bois would visit to better understand the rural Black community and the origins here in Prince Edward County for research that he would do for the U.S. Department of Labor. And that would become the basis for his work with the book, The Philadelphia Negro. And I think it's important too that as you understand the 1951 student walkout that really kind of launched Prince Edward's involvement with Brown v. Board, it's important to, really have an understanding of what was happening here in the community. We note the importance of the activism that these students brought forth. But I want to remind you that, Prince Edward had many examples of a community that was constantly working to advance educational equality. These students here at Moton High School, even though they did this important, courageous act, independent of the adults in their lives, they had great examples to which they could look to. They had great examples such as the Martha E. Forrester Council, who would work tirelessly previously as the Council for Colored Women to advance educational equality in terms of advocating for new school structures, better resources in the classroom. They had great examples to look to through individuals like Reverend L. Francis Griffin and Mr. John Lancaster, who led the Parent Teacher Association. But again, even though they had these individuals they could look to, the students that would lead this walkout in 1951 recognized that there had reached a point in terms of the inadequacies that they were experiencing that they really needed to step forward and create this change on their own. Now, as we talk about, and we can advance the slide here, as we talk about the 1951 student walkout, it's important to recognize what the students were fighting for in that initial fight. This initial fight for the students of Robert R. Moton High was not a fight to integrate public schools. They simply wanted better resources in terms of the facility in which they went to school in. They simply wanted better in terms of the classroom resources that they had been given access to. And that came from the belief that they felt that they had a strong experience at Moton, but that if their teachers were able to offer more, their experience would be that much greater. Now, this is a photo of Robert R. Moton High School. And, just to give you a snapshot of the conditions in which the students attended here at Moton. This was a building built in 1939, the first standalone all-Black high school built in Prince Edward County. This school was built for 180 students, and in the second year of its occupancy, that enrollment had already reached between around 215. And then in the decade that would follow, that enrollment would continue to rise until it reached around 450 students at the time of the student walkout in 1951. This Moton High School was a place that was overcrowded, and the students saw that. You can tell by the photos here that we're sitting in an auditorium that is very much at capacity. They're sitting in an auditorium that very much was at the heart of student life for this high school building. It was the gymnasium, it was the cafeteria, it was overflow classroom space. This space had to be everything to the students because of the lack of facility space and resources that they had access to. On this property, they would build these tar paper shack structures that the students would refer to as adult-sized chicken coops. This would be something that would very much anger the students because they would feel that it was a slap in the face towards the promises that the county continued to not deliver on as it related to a new school building. And so what do you do when you have these concerns and you feel that no one is listening and taking them seriously? You take action into your own hands, and that's exactly what Barbara and her classmates did. And so on April 23rd, Barbara leads this student walkout. Planning had taken place in the months prior to this student walkout. Classmates that Barbara respected would slowly be brought into that planning process. And so on April 23rd, those plans were implemented and all 450 students walked out of school. I think as important as it is that we recognize individuals such as Barbara Johns, it's also important to note the collective activism of the students at Robert R. Moton High. For this effort to be successful, it would take the collective action of all 450 students to walk out of the school building towards the goal that had been set forth. And that's exactly what happened. And so once that student walkout occurred, and we can advance to the second slide, that's when the NAACP would become involved. And on May 23rd of 1951, Virginia NAACP lawyers Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson would file suit in federal court in the case Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward County, Virginia. The complaint charged that inequalities and discrimination in educational facilities existed, but it also claimed that segregation was unconstitutional. The national NAACP ignited a legal campaign in the 30s that was focused on undermining segregated education. This was a county by county strategy that sought to equalize educational facilities. This effort proved tiresome and cumbersome, and oftentimes when favorable outcomes were achieved and won in court, localities did not adhere to those changes, which made the pathway forward frustrating. And so in this post-World War II era, as the NAACP strategy begins to shift, at the time Davis was filed, national NAACP attorneys Thurgood Marshall and Robert Carter were litigating Briggs v. Elliott from Clarendon, South Carolina. There were similar cases in Kansas, Delaware, and DC, all challenging the notion of constitutionality of segregation in education. And the Supreme Court chooses to combine those cases under the case in the name of Brown v. Board of Education, the case out of Topeka, Kansas. Now, this was a strategic decision to show that the issue of segregation was not just impacting the South. And so in Virginia, as it relates to the Davis case, the federal court heard that case on February 23rd and 25th of 1952. County officials hired their legal team, a powerhouse team out of Richmond, to assist with their arguments. They even had the Attorney General, J. Lindsay Almond, who would eventually become governor during the massive resistance era of Virginia, a part of that legal effort as well. They would use arguments that segregation was a way of life in Virginia and it could not be possibly uprooted. They would argue that Black students didn't have the intellectual capacity to be in the classroom, in the same classroom as white students. And following those arguments, the federal court, it was not a favorable decision, and thus the journey continued towards the Supreme Court. But a couple of things happened in Prince Edward County following that federal court decision, or as that case was making its way through federal court. There was a new Robert R. Moton High School built that opened in 1953. This new Robert R. Moton High School solved some of the facility challenges that presented themselves, but it didn't solve the equality in terms of the resources offered inside of that facility. And so the students continued with the legal effort even in spite of that new Robert R. Moton High School. And so as the Supreme Court arguments made their way forward for the Brown decision in 54, and again with Brown 2 in 1955, the justices ordered in that Brown 2 decision, and I think this is important to mention, that integration should occur with all deliberate speed. And so following that Brown 2 decision, and we can move to the next slide, Prince Edward County enters this period of massive resistance. In that period of massive resistance, we examine here at the museum by looking at the activities that are happening on the local, state, and national levels. Nationally, in 1957, there was a showdown in Arkansas that state officials sought to defy orders to desegregate. President Eisenhower would order units of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division to protect students desegregating Central High School. This is something that Virginia wanted to avoid at all costs. They wanted to avoid the media attention and the federal intervention that came about as a result of this decision in Arkansas. During this period of massive resistance in 1956, the Virginia General Assembly empowers the governor to close any school that sought to desegregate under the court's orders. And then this period of massive resistance brought about things such as the pupil placement boards that were given the power to assign students within different public schools as a way to avoid integrating. We would have groups that had a local and statewide presence, such as the Defenders of State Sovereignty and Individual Liberty, organized to lobby state politicians to take a hard stance against desegregating public schools. And so with this period of massive resistance, we see in Virginia that public schools following Brown are closed in Charlottesville, Virginia, Warren County, Virginia, and Norfolk, Virginia by action of the governor. And these were schools that were seeking to integrate. And so with that order from the governor, the federal courts intervened, and the federal courts order that Prince Edward County integrate their public schools. They finally feel that the time has come that Prince Edward integrate their public schools. And so that's when you see here on the local level, Prince Edward County make that decision in 1959 to close its public schools. And so we see Prince Edward County's road to Brown begins with the student strike of 1951. We see the involvement at the state level as it relates to this period of massive resistance following Brown. And we see what happens in a community when by local action, our local Board of Supervisors makes the decision to close public schools here in Prince Edward County. And so, you know, I will stop there. If we advance slides, I just want to just share a bit about the work that we've been able to do at the Moton Museum to share this story. It is important because we are in the 70th year that we commemorate the student walkout of 1951 and the courageous actions of those young students. 70 years, and this is also the year where we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the museum opening to the public. The Moton Museum opened to the public on the 50th anniversary of the Moton student strike in 2001. And so if we advance the slide, we see the work that we have been able to do as we work to share this story with visitors across the state, across the country, regarding the courage and sacrifice of Prince Edward County citizens. We've been able to take this historic structure, the former Robert R. Moton High School, which is now a historical landmark, and we've been able to preserve it in a way that helps to communicate the story. You see here the photo of the auditorium from which Barbara Rose Johns stood in 1951 and encouraged her classmates to walk out. We've been able to restore that space to what it would have looked like in 51 when those students went on strike. If we continue, we also see what we've been able to do with the individual classroom space here at the Moton High School as well. We've been able to take the individual classroom space and turn it into gallery space that helps to tell the story of what happens here in Prince Edward County. The photo on the left is the first classroom space that we were able to modify. And we always felt it was important in this particular exhibit that we talk about the founding documents of the country. And we really begin the conversation of the conditions that would lead the students to go on strike in 1951. We want to set the stage for the environment in which they went to school. And we really want to begin to tell the story of the student experience here at Robert R. Moton High School. As we transition, the photo on the right is the legal gallery. I call it the legal gallery. That's really where we begin to tell the story of the legal effort as it relates to Prince Edward County through the Davis case, and then more broadly, as it becomes a part of Brown v. Board of Education. And so additionally, we've been able to create spaces that explore the role of massive resistance in Virginia by taking a look at massive resistance from a local, statewide, and national perspective. We've been able to tell the story of what happens when public schools close by taking you on a journey of the different paths that students took based upon what was available to them. And then finally, we culminate as we tell the story of that resurgence, the resurgence of student activism with the student protest of 1963, the involvement of the federal government through the Kennedy administration, and the Prince Edward free schools that would open prior to the Griffin v. County School Board of Prince Edward County case that would reopen public schools. And so if we advance to the next slide, we're excited truly as we explore the opportunity for collaboration with the National Trust, with the National Park Service, to become involved with the other sites at the heart of the Brown v. Board of Education decision, because it's our desire to tell this full story. It's our desire to elevate and highlight the other communities at the heart of the Brown decision. And we believe that affiliation with the National Park Service provides us with an additional tool in our toolbox to be able to engage and communicate with members of the public about this important history. And so I show these three photos here. Some ways that we have done that locally is through our Civil Rights and Education Heritage Trail. We've done that through our Farmville Civil Rights Walking Tour. And within the past couple of years, we've been proud to do that in concert with the U.S. Civil Rights Trail. And I do see a comment that popped into my screen from an individual that mentioned the work of Studio Emmons, our architect, who helped us to realize and conceptualize the permanent exhibit that we share today. And we are very proud that we have a digital component that we will be making available to the public as well within the next month. So I'll stop there. I see some wonderful questions that are popping through, and I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Cam. That was a fantastic and extremely thorough presentation. We do have a few questions. Let's start with the first one. A couple of people would like to know if we could share a little bit with them about who Robert Russa Moton was.
That's an important question, and he is an important individual. Robert R. Moton, born in Amelia County, raised in Prince Edward County, was a noted educator and civil rights leader. I think he is more famously known for the role that he played at the Tuskegee Institute in succeeding Booker T. Washington as superintendent of the Tuskegee Institute. And he was really at the helm from a leadership standpoint in helping to lay the groundwork for the Tuskegee Airmen Program. He served in leadership roles at Hampton Institute, which is now Hampton University, and naming our Black schools in Prince Edward County after prominent Black citizens of Prince Edward County was extremely important to the community. You would see Robert R. Moton High School named in his honor. You would see the Mary E. Branch School named after noted educator Mary E. Branch, who was the first Black college president and also one of the founders of the United Negro College Fund. So we very much honor his legacy within Prince Edward County and as our namesake of the museum.
Thank you. So we have another question. The Robert Russa Moton School was constructed in 1939. For those of you who don't know, there was in 1953, another school was constructed as a response to the accusation that the facilities for African-American students were unequal. So one of our attendees would like to know what happened to that 1953 school building.
That's a good question. So the students did make the transition to that new school building. and it became the all-Black high school in the county. And so that transition was made, and the site that they left, which is now the museum, it still was occupied as a school building, but for lower grades once the high school was built. And the building that we sit, Robert R. Moton High, it was occupied as a school building by the county up through the early 90s, even after schools had reopened in '64.
And Cam, another question, who was the architect of the Robert Russa Moton School?
The architect of the Robert Russa Moton, I am not sure of that.
No problem. I think that's a trickier question. It's not as far as I know a well-known architect. But Cynthia, if you would like to send us an email after this webinar, we'll see if we can find that help you find that information if you're still interested. Yeah,
I know I often get a lot of comments that the school structure in which the museum's housed, the original Robert R. Moton, it seemed like a very common architectural concept for all Black schools. I think it was a more cost-effective way at going about construction when you had the auditorium at the center of the school experience. So no matter what direction you went, you had to cross through the auditorium to get to where you were going.
Got it. Thanks, Cam. That's really helpful context. It sounds like this was probably a standardized design. So we have another question. Does the museum feature documents from the Griffin versus Prince Edward County case?
We don't feature, we currently don't have in our archive collection any documents related to the Griffin court case. We do have some photo documents that we were able to obtain as part of our permanent exhibit development. So I would say that, quite honestly, the permanent exhibit is really put together based on photo evidence, based on student voices, based on writings about Prince Edward history that have been developed through the years, really powerful in terms of the first person accounts that we're able to offer. And I would say, honestly, that the collections piece is something that we are diving into a bit heavier as we continue to move forward.
Fantastic. So I think we'll have time for one more question, and that is, so why was Davis listed as the lead plaintiff on this case and not Barbara Johns? Can you tell us more about Barbara Johns and why she actually wasn't a plaintiff in the case?
Yeah, so Barbara leaves shortly after the strike had taken place. There were fears for her safety. Based on some threats that had been made, based on some things that her family were hearing within the community. And so they would send her to live with her uncle Vernon Johns, who at the time was pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And so she would graduate high school in Montgomery. She would attend Spelman as an undergraduate student before moving to Philadelphia for the remainder of her adult life. But yeah, so that's a great question. And so, she's a part of it in name, but she's not the lead figure. Dorothy Davis and her family were the first to sign on.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. Really appreciate you joining us today, giving us this great presentation and answering all of these questions. I apologize for those of you who had questions that we didn't have time to get to today, but if you'd like to follow up with us via email, we can see if we can get those answers for you. And we'll give the email later.
If you send me any questions, I'm happy to answer them
Fantastic.
info@motonmuseum.org.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cam. We appreciate that. So info@motonmuseum.org for any of you who have questions about the history of the school or the related cases. So at this time, we are going to move over to the next part of our program, and I'd like to invite my colleague, Pam Bowman, who's our Senior Director of Public Lands Policy, to provide updates on the work of the National Trust to help create National Park Service affiliated areas and to expand the National Park Service historic site for sites associated with the Brown v. Board case. So take it away, Pam.
Thanks, Kendra. And thank you again, Cam, for an amazing and inspiring presentation. It really has been part of the reasoning and basis for the National Trust getting involved in this particular project. And I'd like to just talk a little bit more about how this is connected to a new legislative advocacy campaign that the National Trust has been leading for the past couple years. You'll see here a little bit of information about the National Park Service. We began this project looking at the fact that when these cases were consolidated, there's really an opportunity still to uplift and share the stories linked to the other 4 communities in Virginia, Delaware, Washington, D.C., and South Carolina. And so we approached this project by looking at some of the existing sites and how they're protected. And you'll see here that the National Park Service's Brown v. Board of Education National Historic Site is located in Topeka, Kansas. And that there was an opportunity to maybe expand and have additional National Park Service sites that represent each of the other 4 court cases and communities. This new legislation was introduced last fall in September and gives an opportunity to share that history and preserve and protect these important places. And the bill would do 2 things. It first expands that Topeka, Kansas National Park Service site to include related sites in South Carolina associated with the Briggs v. Elliott case, and would also establish National Park Service affiliated areas in Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. This is a little bit of information about the legislation that was introduced last fall and then reintroduced in February of this year. You'll see that the legislation is bipartisan and bicameral. There's both the House bill introduced by Representative Clyburn from South Carolina, and you'll see the original co-sponsors listed here, and also the Senate bill introduced by Senator Coons from Delaware, along with 100% participation by each of the United States senators and all of the members of the House of Representatives representing the communities outlined in this legislation. We've been very pleased with the momentum and interest over the last few months, both with additional co-sponsors being added to this bill and the news that we have received from all over the country about how excited people are about this legislation going forward. Some of this information may look a little familiar from previous webinars if you've been following this series, but the one update we did want to share with you is that we do expect that a congressional hearing is forthcoming in the House Natural Resources Committee sometime in the next couple weeks. This will be an opportunity for a panel of witnesses to talk about the importance of this legislation. And as soon as we get more information about that, we'll be sharing that on all of our channels in as many places as possible, so you can follow along as this bill progresses through the legislative process. We have a lot of other ways that you can engage in this big effort to get these House and Senate bills passed, and I'll turn it over to Kendra now to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks so much, Pam. So as Pam mentioned, we are expecting a hearing on this bill sometime in the next couple of weeks. So now would be a fantastic time to have your support. a couple of ways you can do that. First, for individuals who are joining us, you can visit savingplaces.org/BrownVBOE to complete an action item asking your elected officials to support the Brown v. Board of Education National Historic Site Expansion Act. If you are joining us today representing an organization, we would love to have your organization join our group sign-on letter. We are hoping to finalize that letter by this Friday, April 16th. So please, if your organization would like to be part of that letter, email us at brownvboe@savingplaces.org. And then finally, please follow the National Trust website and social media for future opportunities to learn and get involved, as well as updates on when exactly that hearing will be taking place. Next slide, please. So we are coming up on the end of our program, but before we go, we invite everyone with us today to keep the discussion going on Forum Connect, our online community for people in the business of saving places. We have active conversations happening all week around topics from Section 106 to women's history at historic sites and many more. If you haven't joined Connect yet, you should. It's a great place to keep up this conversation and start others. Next slide, please. You can also find opportunities to keep learning about the work of the National Trust. Our next upcoming webinar will be the Tidal Basin in Context, Funding the Public Sphere, and will take place on April 21st, 2021 at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. Next slide. Thank you so much to everyone who attended today's webinar, and a special thank you to Cameron Patterson for sharing the Moton High School story with us. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our email is forum@savingplaces.org. Thank you again.